Thanks everyone for coming along to Professor Wei's guest talk. I'll just briefly introduce our speaker today. Professor Hu is an assistant professor in the Department of Chinese Studies at the National University of Singapore. Her research focuses on the social cognitive reception of translation, and she has published in many international journals, including Target, Translation Studies, the Translator, Interpreter, and Translator Trainer, and Interpreting. She co-guest edited the special issue, Deconstructing Trust in High-Stakes Intercultural Communication, Theoretical, Methodological, and Practical Challenges in Translation Studies 2025. And her recent work, which is what she's going to share with us today, is her publication with Cambridge University Press, Charting Translation Reception Methods and Challenges. And she also serves as associate editor and book review editor for Translation Studies Journal, and is a member of the editorial board of the book series Translation, Interpreting, and Mediation, published by Leuven University Press. And let's welcome Professor Hu.
Thank you so much, Xiaofang, for the. Thank you so much, Xiaofang, for the very kind introduction, very kind words. And thank you so much again for the invitation. It is definitely my great honor and pleasure to be here today and share my thoughts and also have the discussion about translation reception. So today's topic, as mentioned, is about the math models and some challenges I'd like to outline regarding translation reception. My name is Hu Bei. As Xiaofang also mentioned, I'm currently working as an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore, where I teach translation theories, methodologies, mass media translation, consecutive interpreting, and also translation technology. My main research interest definitely lies in translation reception. I'm also very interested in looking at translation ethics and how to use empirical and experimental approaches to translation events in various contexts. So that's today's mission, if you may excuse me. So today we're going to talk about, to answer the key question is, why should we start to look at translation reception at current moments? In the next hour, I'll be looking at how we define translation reception. I will review some major theoretical frameworks that we can use to conceptualize the idea. I will also introduce some key methods and approaches that we could apply in this field. What is perhaps more pertinent would be the factors we have identified that could be used to show how they will affect translation reception already. The talk I will be concluded by suggesting that we really need translation reception, especially when we want to empirically test those real-world scenarios and translational activities. So most of the theoretical stuff have been summarized in the literally very short books, the Charting Translation Reception published by the Cambridge Elements Theory. But for today's talk, I will also use some of empirical studies we have done with our collaborators and colleagues to showcase how the empirical methods can really be used to apply translation reception. And please forgive me, I didn't bring the hard copies to contribute to your library, as we have the research grant to make it open access. So if you're interested, please just feel free to scan the QR code and download it. So why should we look at the translation reception now? To the very basic line is that reception, it means how the messages could be actually actualized or interpreted by the readers. So therefore, translation studies, traditionally, we have lots of discussions on the production side. I was also trained as a translator, so I remember what we usually talk about is how to produce a good or quality translations. So those ideas about good or ethical translations, those concerns are mainly on the production side. The problem is when we talk about what should be considered as a good translation, what is always missing is about the implied readers. We often assume there's an idealized readers. We know they would be there to receive the translation. However, there's limited empirical attention to the real and diverse readerships. So there's a gap between what we assume the translation should achieve and what the readers actually internalize those translational texts. But we have witnessed there's an increasing recent trend that the focus has been shifted slowly but steadily from the source text to the target text. There's more recent increasing numbers of translation studies, especially in the empirical sense, to look at how actual readers respond to different texts. Therefore, we would suggest reception shouldn't be always considered as secondary. Actually, it's the way we define translation, and in another sense that we understand the complication or the implication of translation because we need to test and look at receptions. So on a more personal note about how I started to get interested in translation was because I actually did my undergraduate back in China, but I did my master and my PhD in Melbourne University. So before I moved to Singapore, I stayed in Australia for over 6 years. So when I first landed in Australia, what I was thinking, based on my experience back in China, was that we have this well-established standardized translation glossary. So to be a good translation is usually to get yourself familiar with those glossaries, those political jargon, and those terminologies. Then we assume that good communication will just follow suit. We have this government-sponsored keyword glossary standardized database. So that was the first impression for me about how to produce a good translation. It should be just fixed terms. However, when I stayed in Australia, I started to realize reception could be very complicated when Westerners or your target readers kind of engage with the real communication. This is the case in 2017 when the Chinese then Premier Li Keqiang was invited to visit Australia. He was invited to watch an Australian Football League match. It's Australian football kind of sports, which was considered one of the most violent sports in the world. And the premier at that time, the match was between Sydney Swans and Port Adelaide. As you can see from the picture, the premier was insisting to wearing two scarves for both teams. And this was a picture posted on the front page of the national newspaper, The Australian. So people definitely have some media attention to be given to that kind of image. So I was looking at the newspaper, I was staring at the picture, I was wondering how the ordinary Australians would really understand this kind of message. Will it be considered as a diplomatic gesture, or it might be a little bit different from what we usually assume what a foreign politician who send a message. But when I check, simultaneously, this is a more familiar picture I was more familiar with, published by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's reporting the same event, but definitely they use different pictures. They want to send a different image in this way. But it specifically explained why the premier preferred to wearing two scarves, because this is the official translation, the TT1. I like both teams. Although he explained, although the weather is a little bit hot, I still wear two scarves together because I like both teams and support all Australian football teams. So whoever wins, I will cheer for them. That's the official translation posted by the ministry's website. But if you are familiar with the sports culture, you know in that situation, there's a more idiomatic way of saying, rather than saying whoever wins, I will applaud them. There's another way says, may the best team win. So you kind of sense the culture difference could be playing there. So the task for the institutional translators could be either we go a very literal word for word translation to play safe, or if we want the Westerners better understand the diplomatic good intent the politician would like to send, could you do you prefer to go for a more domesticating version? So that was the moment I started to think, well, the actual reception might be more complicated and more interesting than just stick to the original for the standardized translation version. So if we really believe translation reception matters, what we are talking about is about the readers. Readers could be quite different. There's no single universal readers. We were thinking about the domestic readers who might check the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the students who might want to read bilingual news and to learn a foreign language, but we also have the general readers in the target culture. And reception, to understand the actual reception, it definitely needs to be tested empirically. And also when we want to test reception, at least based on the previous literature, there are 3 levels we can do. The first thing is we just present the picture to show the picture to any individual readers and ask them how to respond to them. Or we can observe their behavior to see whether their behavior could be changed because of the translation, whether they want to read more or they said, that's something I couldn't accept. I really need to do like a retranslation, or you need to give it to another translator. Also, we could test the social implication of the translation at 3rd level. This has been all recorded in the previous literature about how translation reception studies might be conducted. And by defining text here, if you look at the reception, we're not only talking about written text, but also like film interpreting events, crisis communication, or any other multimodal translation texts. But actually, the ideas of reception was not brand new. It has been deeply rooted in translation studies. The first thing come across my mind could be the reception, the literary reception theory. That would also be the most traditional and classical reception theory that affect translation research. And this kind of ideas about reception actually challenge the translation studies beyond the linguistic equivalence. If we focus on the target site, we no longer only produce the faithful rendering of the source text. And this kind of idea can be found in classical translation theory, such as Eugene Nida's dynamic equivalence. Although Nida proposed 2 options, formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence, but he actually preferred the dynamic one, which given lots of attention to the target site. So if you want to translate the Bible to the readers, you definitely need to use the way they can understand but send the same message. That's the basic idea of Nida's theory. And also the scope of theory, functional approaches, they all place a lot of attention to the target site to see how it could be actually used. So the ideas of reception definitely began much earlier than we think. But still, even we already have those conceptualized thinking in the classical translation theories, the actual readers still remain quite underexplained or the exempt. And also when we assume this could be good ethical translation, scholars advocate that translation should be considered as a resistance for some. This kind of idea of assuming what good translation could be is still based on our assumption rather than based on any empirical evidence, so leaving the actual readers out of the picture. When I start to think about how to test the reception, there is a clear gap between what the production might think and what the actual readers who actually responds to those texts. So that's actually part of my PhD project. My PhD project was about looking at how Australian readers receive translated political discourse. So rather than rush into the Australian community and ask them to respond to those translated Chinese texts, I actually come back to China to interview those institutional translators on the production side and ask them, what do you think your readers might respond to those texts? So that's first part of my thesis about looking at institutional translators' expectations for those translated texts. And we have some very interesting and productive interview data. That's the materials I showed to the translators. The source texts were all from official Chinese political discourse. But for each source text, I created 3 different translations with varying levels of translator intervention. From the TT1, the first version is always like a literal translation, which is in principle very close to the official translation published by the government. And the second one, you could consider as a domesticating translation in the sense that we explain some specific jargon, making more readable. And the third one is a radical rewriting, as we try to make it sound like a Western politician who's saying the same scenarios. So we present the task to the institutional translators working for the ministry, for the office of foreign affairs, or those translation companies who have to do a lot of outsourced government translations, and ask for their opinions. So that's what we got from those institutional and staff translators. Many of them really didn't like the creative writings, the creative translations, the high-level translations. They thought there's too much work there. The translator was too creative. They explaining things in their own ways. So it's too risky to go that extreme. And something that would be a rewriting for those interpreters, translators. They kind of believe that translation means literal or word-for-word translation, and rewriting couldn't be justified as a legitimate translation for the political discourse. And some interviewees suggest that why not just stick to the literal, faithful translation? Because they believe from the reception side, they assume that the translators, the readers could actually understand those word-for-word translation, because that's what the original text will try to convey. So when I further asked those institutional translators, so do you have an image, like a mental image about the target readers, like their gender, their demographic information? I find those ideas could be quite vague. We kind of, as translators, assume there would be like a homogeneous set. They're just like target readers in this sense. So now the question boils down to this one: to what extent would the target readers agree with those expectations? Without empirical evidence, one may suggest that text-based quality assessment, like we as translators determine whether this kind of translation could be good enough, remains somehow illusionary and quite prescriptive. This is what we think what our readers who agreed on. So now we really need to test translation theories. As students, as scholars, the first thing coming to mind could be, should we have a reception theory as a theoretical framework to guide our research? So the quick answer is no. There is no single paradigm so far can fully explain translation reception. So the right question perhaps we should ask is that how to study reception, and why should we really choose one method over another? The good thing is that at least we have two paradigms to go. One is social culture approaches, another is more about cognitive approaches. And I'll use some examples to explain how those paradigms could actually apply to testing translation reception. So from the social culture perspective, which is much more dominant in reception research, as we basically agreed, translation scholars who agree that translation is socially constructed through the culture-specific interpretations and conventions. So if translation is socially embedded, so does its reception, right? And there are some major social culture approaches, such as the polysystem theory. Translated text actually could occupy like central or less central role in the target culture. But the main limitation is still remains that when we use those social culture consideration to conceptualize reception, we are not really talking individual readers, but mostly conceptualized in a very vague manner. So here I'd like to illustrate a study we did with colleagues from the Melbourne University during COVID-19 about how this kind of social culture approaches can be used to conceptualize, theorize translation reception. We did this studies during the first year of COVID-19 pandemic. That was back to 2020. So at that moment, Singapore was doing fine and China was doing great. But Australia actually, especially Melbourne, experienced maybe the longest, they call it the longest lockdown period during that specific time frame. And you could see there's a very terrible outbreak of new cases in August 2020. we also observed that the media's attention to translation also increased sharply just right before the big outbreak, which suggests that when there's some healthy crisis, the health crisis uncertainty happening there, people's attention and translation is really at stake. So that's why the media attention was quite prominent at that period. So naturally, we were thinking, so how does the Melbourne multilingual community will actually respond to those translated COVID-19 information? What we did is that we categorized the readers into three main groups to looking at those more linguistically and culturally diverse communities, including the Italian communities, the Greek, and the Chinese one. We interviewed those community leaders and some members and to ask them how they receive those translated information from the health authority. So what we found is that there's a very coherent patterns for the Italian social work organization. The leaders told us that yes, we did receive those official translations given by the Australian Health Authority, but we also used them mainly as references to double check them with the like English materials to verify the accuracy. And for the Italians, the official translation was not taken at face value. They became just one source of information among many others. And the Greek could be more critical in this regard. They said they personally don't trust the translation. So we found that for the Italian and the Greek communities, people tend to be more cautious about official translations. But if you look at the Chinese community, culturally, we tend to invest in more trust in the authority and tend to trust the official translation much better than other multilingual communities. So this is kind of way, if you want to look at reception, we use this kind of social cultural framework to understand these groups, how they receive translations in different ways. So this is a very simple example to illustrate the social culture perspective. We could use their cultural personalities or characters to explain what we found from the empirical data. But if you really look at what actually affect their decision making, we need to look at their cognitive aspects. That's where the cognitive reception come into the picture, and the cognitive paradigms, mainly the approaches and the theoretical frameworks we borrowed will actually come from more established disciplines like reading research, cognitive linguistics, and also psychology. They contribute we could use and borrow and apply their theories and to test how translators or the readers actually digest or interpret those translated materials. And here we could see like the recently we have translation scholars propose the embodied cognition, which indicate that we could actually try to mix or to combine the social cultural perspective with the cognition process. So when we talk about cognitive reception, what we are really trying to say is that people's memory, their affect, and their emotion, how do they feel about the text, really affect their translation reception. Reception in this sense is also affective. One very nice example, and I really appreciate, was actually done another Chen Xuanmei, also a colleague at Nanyang University based in Hong Kong. So her study was about how early translation a reader encountered when in your formative years may become idealized and serve as a mental reference over time, which means for some books you read when you were kids, even when you grew up, you may encounter much more better translation in terms of quality or the linguistic faithfulness. You could still have a very fond memory of the books, of the translation versions you read when you were kids. So this is a very nice example to actually challenge the idea that retranslation are automatically better than early versions. Even if you just look at quality assessment, the most recent translation, in most cases, they might be considered as a bad version as it's become more faithful, become more accurate. That's the, as some of you may be familiar with, the retranslation hypothesis. So this kind of cognitive reception study challenge the very notion of retranslation hypothesis, and it also suggests that there's no linear models of translation progress. People's reception could be very dynamic, and it's not only determined by the textual quality assessment, but also by people's feeling, by their emotion. So following this cognitive part, we further looking at why the Chinese communities they trust the authority information, yes, but how they actually cognitively interpret those health information during the COVID-19. So at that moment, people not only receive information from the mainstream news, they also came across and got information from social media. So this study was about how the Chinese communities based in Australia, they receive information from those WeChat public accounts. We look at some widely circulated, which might suggest as widely received translations, and to analyze their textual features. And what we found is that in this case, there was a news about how an Australian nurse wrongly, who actually made a mistake, gave the wrong dose of vaccination to the patient. So the health authority didn't want to want to take any actions against the nurse. So for the Chinese translation here, they faithfully rendered what was talking about in the health authority news. However, what they added is the names, kind of use this as an illustration to suggest that the Chinese believe that we shouldn't be killing the chicken to scare the monkey, like we take any action against the health stuff, but Aussies don't want to scare the monkeys at all. So although they faithfully render what authority would say in that scenario, they also use this kind of nationalist narratives to subtly, implicitly, to suggest their attitudes. And this kind of using emotion or feelings, which definitely affect people's reception, as is evident in the widely received the social media posts in that case. So we now have two paradigms, the social culture approaches as well as the cognitive one. But here is the current direction and perhaps the gaps. There's still a very weak theorization of the links in between. If you look at most reception research, normally we could try to prioritize one over another. It's either too very focusing on the social culture as the general reception of the text, or we look at very individual at a micro level. But the good thing is we also have seen the methodological expansion. More and more studies try to narrow the gap and by tap into different forms of translation, such as digital social readings. And also there already have some attempts to bridge the cognitive and social cultural reception. One pioneering attempts could be Heidi Kruger in her PhD thesis. She's looking at comparing the adult and children readers, how they respond to the same books, whether they have any divergence or differences. She looked at the social culture as the reading cultures in South Africa, but she also used eye tracking to do like the cognitive aspect, which showcase a very nice example that we definitely have some ways to combine these two paradigms. So when we try to consider why we need to narrow the gap, we are actually trying to say readers could be very different. If you just look at the social culture readers, you're talking about theoretical readers, but for actual real readers, we need to test their reception at the cognitive level. So this could be the readers was really playing a key role in translation reception. And readers can be very different. Their Andrew Chessman has an early definition about how we could categorize readers. His idea is that we could have the typical readers, which means the general public, like the book readers of the publication. And we could also have aptical readers, which means translators, translation students, who tend to be more rigorous. We sometimes have this kind of experience. If you present a translation to your parents, they may say, okay, fairly enough, I can understand what's going on here. But if you present the same translation to students, to professional translators, because we are trained to be quite rigorous or picky, we tend to always find translation mistakes. So we will consider in an anti-transmission sense that we are ethical readers. And also some readers can be quite clear and others are unstable. If we look at literary translation, as the literary translator, if I know that my readers will be someone who may come across the book in 25 years, my strategy could be much different from the interpreters who might just want to render the text for someone who's sitting next to me. So this kind of translator interpreters, imaginary readers would definitely affect their translation strategy. We did a study with the institutional translators, and I remember a case is about the institutional interpreters told me about the story. For them, it's really like a lesson. They said they remember example of Qian Qishen, the former Chinese minister of foreign affairs. So there's a conference, and the prime minister said, 山不在高，有仙则灵. So the interpreters, because it's so culturally rich and it would be very difficult to explain everything at that very short time span. So the interpreter just tried to summarize the idea. But because the speaker also knew some English, so he was not very happy with the adaptation, the rewriting kind of summary. So he's not very happy, and he said, where's the mountain? I said, mountain, why you didn't give me the word? So for the institutional interpreters, that was really something they try to make it as a rule of thumb. So never try to go to radical rewriting the source text, always stick to the source text. So even we kind of expect that when you interpret for the government, for the government leaders, the target readers could be the target language audience. However, there's some readers might be given more priority in that scenario, such as their own clients, their colleagues, and even as the speaker themselves. So in this way, we find there's a lot of power relations come into play when we try to define translation readers. So do we still have methods that we can categorize the readers in a more critical way? In this study, to test the Australian readers' reception of translated Chinese political discourse, I create kind of like a familiarity test. So we had 10 items, and for each item, each Chinese political jargon, we try to make it as a multiple option question and ask the readers before you start to evaluate the translations, please do the familiarity test first and see. And in this way, we could categorize their actual engagement and their understanding or knowledge of the topic. So in this one, we ask them in the phrase dealing with both tigers and flies. The tiger and fly may refer to. So shall we just do this together? The first one is China's major and minor environmental problem, or China's high-level and low-level corrupt officials, or their criminal issues, or their immediate and future economic and social and political challenges. So what do you think? Doing B, yes. So it's actually concerns the anti-corruption campaign. So in this way, we categorize the readers into different groups in terms of we also ask question about whether you have been to China. We record their self-reported knowledge of Chinese language and their also knowledge of China based on the familiarity test. Try to make a better picture of what we are when we talk about target readers, who we are really referring to. So this is one way we could definitely categorize readers. Why we need to characterize readers? Because their expectations could really affect their decision and their understanding of their responses to the source, to the translation text, and their expectations. If we are talking about a given group, it could become like the norms. Norm theory goes back to Turey and Andrew Chessman. But what I'd like to highlight here is Heidi Koz's and her colleagues' recent work about defined expectancy norms as social cognitive templates, which means you can consider this as kind of like a reception framework, which combined both cognitive and social dimensions, which could be used to explain why a specific group of readers might interpret translation in a certain way. So this is a study that we could use to illustrate how this kind of templates could actually be used in understanding translation and its reception. This was a study about Guo Baokun, who is a Chinese Singaporean playwright, and I use his very seminal play, The Descendants of the Unique. It's about Zheng He, the main character, and see what I did was that because the play was first created and penned in English, but it was then self-translated into Chinese in the same year in 1995. And I used the comments and also the critics and reviews, try to understand why this play was so well received in Singapore. And also they got some very controversial reviews. So why it echoes so deeply with the contemporary Singaporean readers. And to understand this play, just a very quick summary about it is that the play draws on Zheng He, the historical Chinese navigator who was sent by the Ming Emperor from India to Arabic. And also Zheng He became the figure of displacement who is physically suffering and isolated culturally and politically. And this actually echoes deeply with the playwright Guo Baokun himself, as he was in prison for several years because of his political views. And both Zheng He and Guo Baokun are considered as in-between figures. They are powerful but also vulnerable. They are visible, but they could also be considered as marginalized by different powers. And some critics even suggest that the play was used to criticize Singapore's multicultural identities in a more implicit way. But to understand its translation strategy and its reception, we could use as a social cognitive templates as ocean as a culture space. This goes back to Singapore's geographical position. It was self-identity as the little red dot, as it was culturally and geographically isolated. It's away from many places, but it's also surrounded by the ocean. And Guo Baokun's play actually, it's not really speak from the one fixed culture position. It moves across historical, language, and identity. So does Zheng He himself in the narratives. So for the author translator, the ocean is definitely a place for transition, negotiation, and navigation. And for Singaporean readers, they deeply understand and echo with this kind of feelings as life between cultures. It goes back to the migration memory, and their multilingual identities. So to understand this play is really about how the contemporary audience recognize themselves through translation and cultural memory. So by analyzing the results and the comparative textual analysis of the two versions, I feel the ocean as a cultural space, as a social cognitive template could be quite useful. But I think what we need to emphasize here is that any social cognitive templates applied in reception studies shouldn't be considered as the definite answer to its translation. It mainly served as a useful methodological yardstick for us to explain the data or what we found from the translation. They could be quite helpful for us to really narrow down our focus and provide possible hypothesis that for scholars could be continued to test it. So now we really need to start to test translation. Do we have any methodologies? the lines can be much longer than this, but here I'd like to showcase three major or very useful ways that we could think about. The first is questionnaire surveys, and then quasi experiments, and also big data analysis. Survey could be considered as the most classical, widely used approach that has been applied to translation reception. Early study usually use survey to test readers' understanding of the text, whether they prefer one translation strategy or another. And what is more interesting here is that we actually could learn a lot from our interpreting colleagues. In interpreting studies, there's a long tradition. It's about user expectation surveys. They use questionnaires to ask other, especially peer interpreters, what would be the most important criteria for interpreting fidelity, completeness, accent, or fluency. So survey could be very useful. However, its limitation lies in that we still, if we want to explain reception, we still need more clearer criteria and mixed methods to go beyond the survey approach. So what I'm trying to stress here is that we have seen a clear line that we could definitely combine survey with quasi experiments. The quasi experiments, I would say quasi, which means it's not like rigorously controlled, like lab-based, like most eye-tracking studies. But by combining both approaches, it will help us to understand what users say the values, like give the factual information, by also looking at and observe how they actually respond. We could ask the users and readers to do some real task in an experimental sense and see how they correspond to what they provided as factual information. So we could use this kind of research design to test comprehension, reading difficulties, their interpretation, and their decision making. This was by Susanna Balda's 2025 paper published in the journal Target. She and her colleague were looking at people's reception of health information, which is I would highly recommend if you're interested in translation research to look at that paper. And also by combining the two approaches, we can have this kind of mixed methods to reduce the limits of single method research. Like survey can be biased at some point, and experiments might be too artificial and be too narrow. And we can also add follow-up interviews, open-ended questions to further enrich our results. So here I'd like to illustrate the most recent studies I'm doing in Singapore with my colleagues. We look at how Singaporean readers respond to machine-mediated medication information. We have a very interdisciplinary team, me from translation studies. We have people from public health, medicine schools, and also representative from the government's health promotion board. So the idea is that we have this government website sharing health information, sharing medication information, and we want to test if readers respond to those texts. If we use machine translation to translate those texts, whether their reception may be vary. So we focus on their comprehension, trust, readability, and satisfaction. So for each text, we give 4 conditions. We have the English source text. We use Google Translate to produce a raw machine translation. We had a collaborative post-editing translation done by professional translators and health experts. We also specifically choose those official translation which already have the authentic government-produced translation. So we invite 20 adults, readers based in Singapore for this study, and it took us like 2 months to collect all those data. So in designing the questionnaires, we have 4 medications. For each participant, they are going to go through the 4 medications, but each with a different tax condition because we counterbalance the materials. We also try to make the text more comparable between groups. We ask their demographic information, their English, Chinese proficiency test, and also ask their engagement with machine translation and also their previous experience in multilingual health encounters. So by using this way, we kind of combined those demographic survey questionnaires with some actual quasi-experimental settings, because we asked them to really complete those comprehension questionnaires, like, because it's all about medication prescription. So for the questionnaires, it's usually asked them whether you should take the medication before or after meal, so we could test whether they could actually understand in the translation or in the source text. If you use questionnaire, this is basically what you can get. You can get some very factual information about the gender balance, about to what extent they trust, and their experience about the doctor-patient communication. But what is more interesting is that things you ask them to do some experiments to complete reading and comprehension test. So you could see that whether those demographic information could actually be linked to their comprehension tests. Here, the figure actually shows their comprehension score with to what extent they trust the translation. Here is what we found from the study is that people's objective comprehension sometimes could be quite different from their subjective evaluation, because their objective comprehension was measured through those comprehension tests. But we also asked the readers to suggest to what extent you trust the information, to what extent you think you are satisfied with those texts. And we found that machine translation was rated as the relatively trustworthy, very much to our surprise, even when their objective comprehension was much lower. Which means when the Singapore readers, most of them, when they read machine translation, even it sounds very awkward at some point, or it's very literal, they still say they trust those translation. One possible reason is that because it sounds like a very literal translation, so they believe it actually reflect what's say in the source text. So that's why they trust the machine translation. But their understanding doesn't increase accordingly, because the raw machine translation could be quite misleading in some cases. The collaborative translation as a high quality translation showed a much closer match between comprehension and trust. And even the users indicate that they trust machine translation. Their satisfaction was actually lower for the machine translation case, because even they assume they're credible because it's awkward. So their readability actually was not that good. So their satisfaction actually dropped. So this actually told us that in house translation or house communication, a text may feel understandable or trustworthy, but still we need a lot of human post editing. Even for the certain group of people, especially currently people widely use generative AI or machine translation, we kind of put too much trust in technology. But this kind of empirical study suggests that your actual comprehension, doesn't necessarily increase if you wrongly trust those technology. So this could be a case to show how we could combine the questionnaire and the quasi-experiment research design to really play around different variables and to get some meaningful results. And this one, the last approaches I'd like to introduce here is about the big data analysis. Reception, as we are getting abundance of information. Remember the the Singapore case study, it really took us 2 months to collect all the 200 participants' data. And if you combine the time we spent in applying for the ethics application, it's really like a 1 year study. But so far, we have lots of big data online. And if you use those research methods, you could find you actually have lots of empirical studies, empirical data you could play around. And when we talk about big data reception, there are 2 prominent kind of data people are usually come across. The first one is like the 弹幕, it's like on-screen comments. We do have many colleagues have been conducting very extensive research on this respect. For those who might not be very familiar with this, I'll just play this short clip, and you could see how those online users who provide the real-time comments on the
入者恳恳以尽忠，出者谦谦以自毁。
When one is in office, he should discharge his duty conscientiously. When leaving office, he should conduct himself with humility and exercise self-reflection.
So by analyzing those real-time on-screen comments, we could definitely see how readers would like to give comments or evaluate specific interpreting. And the other one is we could also look at those online comments, whether it's on the YouTube video or other posts. This is a Malaysian Mandarin band, so it's very interesting as they produce those festive songs every year, which actually could be quite well received in the Chinese communities outside China. This song is about the South-North Expressways, which connecting Singapore and Malaysia. And in this video, it actually had a lot of mixed coding, language multilingual components, and it had. I'll show the video first, and then we can see some very interesting online comments.
小时候我记得这个记忆，加上2倍的到至今要准备很多东西，带一些漫画，一些零食，一些咖啡游戏，在听着电台播的新年歌到夜幕降临，累了停一下，有暂停一下，后面跟着的进去就不出来玩一下，南北大道理，爸妈的大道理，教会了我现在怎么活得更有底气。全长772公里，大大小小的行李有多拥挤？爱睡的你靠过来也没关系，到了目的地放心，我会再叫醒你。一路回家那路上都有你，副驾有你是最美的风景。看着窗外晴朗的天气，期待按下你的门铃，说一句恭喜你，好久不见我好想你，祝福你，我想要祝福你，公路上有你我的回忆。To the S to the E， 喝到 all the way to JB。M to the S to the E，Speed limit 要注意。I woke up in the morning， 穿上我的新衣，今天 gonna be 很 happening。四面八方的亲戚聚在一起，搞巴拉本领，互相吹嘘多么本领，互相问候多么关心，就是这个 feel 多么温馨，多么开心，多么尽兴，多么幸运。小时候我记得这个记忆，加上。
Yeah, so that's a very typical song they produced, and it went viral online. And if you look at the comments, just for this specific one, there are over 3,000 comments on this video. And there's some in Chinese, some in Malaysian, and some in English. And you will find if we want to analyze this, we don't need to actually collect the actual users we know in the real life, but by analyzing those online comments, it will definitely show a very diverse and interesting finding of the reception of the song. And this is a study we did also based on the similar big data analysis, is that we look at the Wikipedia talk page. Normally we use Wikipedia entries as a reference, but for each entry, there's a talk page which record how the translator users and translator readers debate and argue against each other, deciding how to translate specific terms. This one is how people argue against each other about how to translate the word COVID-19 in the Chinese version on Wikipedia. And there are over 10,000 comments on this. You could consider in a broad sense as a reception study of how people disagree or agreed with each other's translation decision making. And if you like to spend 6 or 8 hours to go through all the threads, all the lines, you may also give a kind of idea of who's more active in this kind of online debate. But by using social network analysis, we could visualize this very complicated reception in a much clearer way. Here we visualize the top 21 users who participated in the 3-year debates, and you will find actually the most 2 active users were just quite obviously shown on the social network analysis map. And then you can narrow down your research focus to looking at why these two opinion leaders, what their justification and what kind of debates they were actually going during this translation production and also the reception process. So we find that big data analysis could be quite useful in a way that help us to navigate the abundant information and navigate very complicated reception. However, what we also need to bear in mind is that we need to use it very carefully. It has its own ethical issues and its own limits, such as that planned phone reception sometimes may commodify the user behavior. This could be something when we start to use big data analysis, we will always need to bear in mind. And also because we try to equalize, we try to make it accumulated. So when we analyze the data, we always need to think about the translator or the reader agency when we navigate or try to interpret or summarize the complicated reality. So we have talked about theory, methods, and now we really need to answer the question. So what kind of factors could actually affect translation reception? There could be many variables or candidates. Here I'd like to illustrate 4 factors we found could condition translation reception. The first one is about linguistic and textual quality. If the translation is too literal, it doesn't make any sense, it may cause misunderstanding. This was still the case. We found, remember the Chinese premier wearing 2 scarves. So for the literal translation, we borrow it from the official version. It said, although it is still hot in Sydney, I will wear 2 scarves to show my love and support for both teams. That's exactly what the official translation did. So it translates Chinese 喜欢 into love. However, when we present this translation to the Australian readers, some point out love is a very strong word. So for Chinese premier, who was his first time to Australia, the first time he watched a match, to what extent how he could possibly love to Australian football match teams. So some translators suggest that it's not very sincere of the premier. However, this kind of diplomatic gesture was wrongly interpreted, basically due to the literalism. So if the translation quality is quite low, the risk of literalism could become quite high and affect translation reception accordingly. So does that suggest that we should abandon literalism, word for word translation, just try to make it more domesticating, try to adapt those texts and try to make it more fluent to the target readers? What we found is that the answer is not that straightforward. Yes, culture distance could definitely affect people's understanding. If the text sounds too foreign, people who really reject them because they couldn't understand, they couldn't follow. However, we also found that culture distance could be an effective road. If you keep some foreign elements in the translation, in some cases, your readers may also find the translation to be quite interesting. So in this case, in the source text, the Chinese president said, 桃李不言，下自成蹊. So the official translation gave a very literal one as peaches and plums do not speak. So we asked the readers, how do you understand this kind of literal translation? Even for Chinese, the original could be quite abstract in a certain way. To our surprise is that many readers actually said it creates kind of imaginary. They admit that they couldn't understand it at all, but they feel they sound very philosophical. So it's kind of interesting. And for some readers, they think, because I want to learn some Chinese, I'm interested in Chinese culture. So this kind of literal translation has its pedagogical way. So it's not that easy that we should totally abandon literalism. If you keep the foreign elements at a reasonable level, the cultural distance sometimes could be quite effective. So readers are willing to accept foreign elements if they feel it reflects the original meaning authentically or has some pedagogical values. And also we suggest that if we give some very adaptative very foreignization, rewriting text with high level of translator intervention, the readers might automatically appreciate the translator efforts, which suggests it's the opposite. Like in the same translation, the wearing stuff one, because the rewriting version said wearing too footy stuff is a bit much, and some readers said this is a very Australian way of saying things like footy stuff. So I doubt the Chinese premier who really say things like that. So in that case, even the text itself, the readability is relatively high. They could easily understand it, but they don't trust it's what original text actually said. So we boil down to our third factor is about trust. People's trust in translation's intention really matters and could determine their reception or their acceptance of the source text. If it's a very literal one, as long as the readers believe that it feels like the translator respect the original, whether to what extent I can understand it, but I believe it's a very faithful and accurate translation, they could still accept this kind of low-level translator intervention. On the other hand, high-level domestication might lead to suspicious about translators' motivations. Some readers comment that it feels like they're trying too hard to make it sound Western. So in that sense, even it's very easy to follow, they still reject the translation as it is. Therefore, we propose like a trust-based trade-off model of translation reception. Readers don't need full comprehension to accept a translation, as shown in that study, but they're willing to tolerate some levels of foreignness if they trust the translator's intention and their motivation, such as produce a faithful rendering of the source text. On the other way, the culture assimilation or radical rewriting could be quite risky if it would be perceived by the readers as manipulated, which might pose a risk to the trust and faithfulness of the source text. We think trust is very interesting. So last year we did a special issue dedicated to this topic. We get some very good line of authors who contribute to this special issue, and we analyze trust in various scenarios and many from the reception perspective. Like Angia and the colleagues at Melbourne University, they look at historical translators' work regarding trust. Anu and Esther, their teams both look at the reception of interpreting. Anu's work is about social worker interpreting, and Esther's and her team looking at the reception of interpreting technology. We also have cases from the communication crisis, from the crisis communication, and also Jose and Maria Isabel. They look at translators' trust and distrust about the reception of generative AI tools. So we find that this is really an ongoing dialogue, and we look forward to more research to be done in terms of trust and its relation to translation reception. So this could be the last part of the talk that we really want to emphasize. Why we really need to start translation reception is that they definitely have divergent implications on the real world. This was a study I did during COVID-19, because it's basically 2021, 2022 when Singapore was in the lockdown and we were unable to travel. So I ended up watching too much Netflix. Too many Netflix shows, and kind of made me feel a little bit guilty. So I was thinking how we could turn the screen time into something productive. So I was curious about the reception of those Netflix shows, as they're quite influential on social media and on the real world. So this was the one we chose as a case study. It's called American Factory. Ironically, it's actually a Chinese factory because it's the Yao's company, the big company. They purchased the American one based in the States, and the workers in that scene could actually be American workers, the managers from the Chinese side. There's lots of culture tensions and dialogues, mixed language dialogues happening here. So this is just a very quick example to show the documentary was produced in bilingual, but you could see Netflix actually provide both their English and translations to the source.
对美国人处理要有这技巧，就说 我们怎么能够用它的优势，来能够帮福耀做事情？在美国呢，我为什么起的是呢？就美国呢，它这个文化呢，是属于从小是鼓励为主，所以每个美国长的孩子，或者每个大人都是 overconfidence 啊，超自信，就是超自信。就这个社会呢，在美国地方呢，捅死人不常用。你要跟他动手打架的话，你可能会有问题。实际上，中国的话很多都是对的哈，其实人都是顺毛驴，对吧？驴呢，你顺着它弄没事儿，你一逆它一定撂蹶子。我说话听懂吗？听懂了 ，OK。这个呢，需要咱们的智慧，就是需要怎么去引导他们，去帮助他们，因为你比他强。
So what we were watching was actually the Fuyao. They have this kind of a coach to educate their Chinese manager how to manage those American workers. But because we know Chinese, we could kind of understand the dialogues. But if you compare what was actually speaking Chinese and the English subtitles, you could find there are some differences. One is explicitation, like the source text said, literally it says, how can we use their strengths to help we out to do things, right? The Netflix English subtitle is that, how can we take advantage of American characters? It's not a wrong translation, but it definitely makes some explicitation to make, if you are English speaker, if definitely the Fu Yao is taking advantage of American, that message was much clearer in the English subtitles. In another scenario and another case, the Chinese manager complained that once we managed American workers, they said they could go to the union. And the Netflix subtitles said that they threat to get help from the union. So it made the culture tensions much more explicit in the Netflix English translation. And they used kind of quite different strategies, including omission or addition. Like here is a case, the Chinese manager said, we, just like you, because they also have the American management, we don't want to see the union develop here. And in the Netflix translation, very interesting, they just cut the just like you. It says more like the Chinese management doesn't want to see development of the union. Some may suggest that omission is a very common strategy in audiovisual translation. However, in another case, we find there are lots of addition. They add things there. For instance, it said a Fu Yao Chinese worker said he actually quite enjoyed his work at the company. He said, I work here for 20 years exactly because I like the job and I like my role. However, in the Netflix English, it surprisingly adds something like it's a hard job, but I love it. The hard job information was not in the source text. So if you did this kind of comparative analysis, you will find that if you relied on the English subtitles for English audience, what they got from the documentary is that it reinforced the opposing tensions between American workers and the Chinese management. The cultural conflicts were much more prominent in the Netflix official English title. But for the Chinese subtitles, we have lots of empirical data to show that American workers, their attitudes towards Chinese was actually turned down. So this might explain why the documentary received slightly different receptions in the English world and in the Chinese community. So we found the translator intervention and social culture implication for reception. We are not suggesting that it's all the translator's fault. Translation should be take the blame for any cultural misunderstanding. Quite opposite, what we are suggesting here is that we need to really pay attention to the role of translation in cultural relations and to what extent trust and distrust may be affected by translations. And also we couldn't ignore the fact that those Netflix shows, it's not only about the translator's own decision making, it's also we need to consider the media's logic and their commercial formalization in display. Netflix kind of tried to present the real world bias in a way its official translations tend to intensify those conflicts. So for the media company, it's a more understandable logic as a commercial logic. We want things to be very black and white, very clear cut. But the reality is much more complicated. if you look at authentic roles and the things in the film, you will find that the real world is much more complicated than we try to make it as a simple white and black cut in that way. So reception is in this way, we suggest that different translation settings definitely require different approaches, but we actually trying to suggest is that it shouldn't be reduced to quality assessment. We definitely move beyond the textual analysis of the translation itself. What we really want to pay attention is that we should use reception research to address or at least to discuss those contemporary issues, which shouldn't be simplified media logic by the commercial companies, but really looking at how actual peoples engage each other and what kind of misunderstandings may be happening and what kind of strategies could be used to address the trust and distrust issues between culture relations. So to summarize the contribution, if we think translation reception really matters to translation studies, when we talk about reception, we're talking about people and their identities. We're not suggesting that translation should be always adapted to what users' expectations, since we are moving the focus to the reception side. What we are suggesting is the roles of readers, translators, and translation scholars are interconnected. So we're looking at how people understand and interpret text in the actual way. And because the reception really concerned culture relations, during the process, trust building plays a key role as established trust between readers and translators could be a shared responsibility, which is critical for the success of translational communication and interculture engagement. And also the complexity and risk in intercultural communication should be identified, usually empirically supported by lots of reception studies. And we had a very interesting, lovely talk yesterday with some Hong Kong colleagues. We're talking about the use of AI and generative AI and machine translation. So the agreement would be that because thanks to the generative AI, more and more documents and text could be translated automatically in a most cost-effective and much faster way. So at this point, what we really need is more reception, empirical reception studies to looking at how those translations actually pose any implication on the actual word. So I guess the message is quite simple. What we really need to do is keep testing empirically the reception and keep the dialogue going. So that will be the talk for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Barry, for and also in the overview of translation reception theory with the examples as well. So let's open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Professor Fu. It is a very, very enlightening and inspiring speech, especially for me. I'm researching on the reception of the translations. I have a kind of sharp question about the relationship between translation reception and translation quality. So from your research career and from the research footage, I could find that the reception is somehow a little bit more contextualized and more related to the ordinary peoples or people from all walks of life, their reception towards a certain work. But quality of translation for a long time is kind of being rigidly, decontextualized. That means the quality check or the quality assessment of a translation work is basically on the linguistic level or on the text itself. So I really want to know that if the reception study of translation is kind of diverging the future path of translation studies into a divergent way. That means the translation quality research and translation reception research will develop into separate ways, or if the reception study will enrich or adding some new layers or new perspectives to the translation quality research.
Thank you so much for the very good question. It's about the differences of the future of translation reception and quality assessment. we have very good colleagues doing quality assessment, so they wouldn't really be agree that translation quality assessment will be part of translation reception, or reception studies should be part of quality assessment. I think both make good sense. Depends whether you're talking about methodology or whether you're talking about the purpose of this kind of research line. But what I think what is more important here is that we should use whatever methods we have to test the implication and to serve our research purpose. So for quality assessment, if the purpose is to look at a specific text in a given situation, which one may serve the specific purpose better, then quality assessment does necessary values on this respect. For reception studies, I would suggest that it might have more diverse focuses. So you could test it from the social culture perspective. You can do it as a textual along analysis, but you could also test the specific reader's cognitive responses to the text. So it really depends on your research purpose rather than stick to, I would just be a reception scholar and you are doing the quality assessment. I don't think the separation could be that necessary. It really, your research paradigms and the methods should definitely serve your research purpose for your topic.
So it's not one superseding another, but working in different ways.
Yeah, I think it really depends what you're going to test in your study, and it's not like a zero-sum game that we should choose one over another. It's fine. It's fine.
Actually, got one question. So, really make a very discussion about how to open up translation reception study with big data analytics. And especially you mentioned nowadays people are experimenting with demo and also these YouTube comments under the YouTube video. But my question is, when we look at this type of data, like demo, for example, what are the criteria those audience are using to evaluate the quality of translation in that case? Or how do we set like a framework or criteria with which we can say, okay, this audience has like a high level trust or a high reception of translation in the demo?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I couldn't pretend I'm the expert of Danmo. I know some colleagues even online who be more suitable to answer the question, but to my understanding is that there are some features regarding demo itself we can use as criteria to assess reception, such as the numbers of demo. You can see if there's one specific moment, like the same, whether it's an interpreting or translation scenarios there, you can see the numbers increase sharply. So which means it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good translation. It could be quite opposite. It's a gross translation, but it at least suggests that this could be the place we'd like to look at. So this could be quite different if you like if it's more like a process oriented translation reception. The real-time comments, the time frame, and the numbers will give you some indicators. So that's my understanding of what demo reception research could contribute to the general dialogue or conversation in this regard. Another thing is, as we showed in the video, it's an interpreting event. So normally we couldn't. But interpreting is quite peculiar. Sometimes it's just closed door, right? You couldn't really interview the audience on site and ask at that specific moment what you were thinking about it. But using the demo, you can see how diverse readers, like even the general public, who responds to the specific interpreting renderings at a very given time frame. So I guess this kind of both process and both it's a little bit like a quality assessment, but in a real time scenario. Yeah. Please.
before this COVID case, translation book was in Australia, like how the Chinese, how different minorities in the country receive that. I'm interested to know, like, why do we care how people receive the information, like how they receive the translation? That did it make a big difference if the translation is considered like literal, good, proper, or if the translation is like a very user-friendly version? Has there been any study about like the difference between how people, attitudes, when they have different attitudes, they receive the information differently. So, but how would that have affected the result of the translation itself? Because, for example, the COVID case, all you want to do is to get the message across all the people, including minorities. But did it matter that much if the translation is like a proper one or more, like I said, the user-friendly one?
Thank you so much for the question. It all goes back to how we define house communication. Here we kind of define house communication as behavior change communication. When we translate the information, the purpose is not to assess the quality itself, but to look at to what extent the receivers would like to adapt their behavior in accordance to the information. We do have empirical evidence to suggest that if people do not trust the information, the house information, it could take much longer time for them to change their behaviors. This has been quite widely tested. So the government, if you, as the health authority, if you want to translate, if you want to spread the words to multilingual communities, you will find some community who react quite properly. But for others, because they have very lower trust in those translations, partly because of their cultural awareness, like they don't trust authorities at all, or because the translation quality itself was not that good. It was not quite fluent, so it makes some misunderstanding, leads to misunderstanding. The responses could be quite slow, which could cause more severe health consequence. They don't trust information, they wouldn't follow the guidelines. So we suggest that this could be the one of the main social consequence translation could cause, especially during those health uncertainty time.
Actually, this question is somehow related to the generalization of the research findings. Just like the cases you have shown before, we could witness that almost all reception studies focus on special cases, like focusing on a certain video, on certain literature work, and the research participants included in this research are somehow also contextualized. I mean, some certain group of people, like the Damu centers or the foreign language speakers within special local, like in Australia. So I really wonder if the kind of generalization will become a problem in promoting the research into a wider academic discourse, because since the reception is somehow subjective and the research findings themselves are a little bit confined to the certain group the researcher has dived into. So how the generalization become a problem or not become a problem?
Thank you so much for the very good question. The assumption is that, and I agree that the findings of reception studies will always be contextualized and situational, but I wouldn't consider this as a limitation. It suggests that whether we should do research only to try to produce some universal knowledge that can be applied to every scenarios. I think empirical evidence has suggested that there's no such universal paradigms that could be applied to every single case. And this might not be one necessary outcomes as researchers we try to pursue. What we really care is about whether this kind of hypothesis, any research results could be considered as hypothesis rather than factual truths. So what we really need to do is to keep testing. So like in this specific given context, if we find these findings that we could conceptualize it as a cognitive social templates, this could be a nice templates or hypothesis that other scholars can use them to apply to other situations and see to what extent they could be verified. And by accumulating those knowledge, we kind of get a better understanding of the actual complicated word, rather than saying that what we found in one specific case should be universal and applied across the temporal frame. So I guess that's why we suggest and advocate for empirical study, because the basic idea is we keep testing the theories and testing all the findings as theoretical hypotheses.